long before the names of Athens, Sparta, or even classical Greece echoed across the Mediterranean. Another people occupied the landscapes that would later become the heart of Greek civilization. Their story survives only in fragments. No king left behind a grand chronicle in their own language that historians can read with certainty. No empire carved its history into endless walls of stone describing every victory and every defeat. Instead, what remains is something far more intriguing. A handful of ancient writers remembered them. Archaeological discoveries quietly revealed traces of their lives beneath layers of earth. Ancient place names refused to disappear even after entire cultures had faded away. Forgotten languages left mysterious echoes and inscriptions that scholars still debate today. These scattered clues form the outline of a civilization that stood at the crossroads between myth and history. That civilization is known as the Pelasgians. Even today, after generations of archaeological excavations and historical research, they remain among the most debated peoples of the ancient Mediterranean. Who exactly were they? Were they a single nation? Were they many related communities sharing similar customs? Or was the word Pelasgian simply the label later Greeks used whenever they encountered ruins older than themselves and traditions whose true origins had already been forgotten? These questions have fascinated historians for centuries. Every generation has attempted to solve the mystery. Every new excavation adds another piece to the puzzle. Yet each answer often creates new questions. Unlike civilizations such as Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon, whose histories survive in thousands of written records, the Pelasgians must be reconstructed through careful comparison between archaeology, linguistics, ancient literature, and environmental evidence. Each discipline reveals only part of the picture. Only when these pieces are examined together does a remarkable story begin to emerge. It is a story that begins thousands of years before the classical age. It begins in a world where the coastlines of the Aegean were already busy with merchants and sailors, where fortified settlements overlooked fertile valleys, where farmers cultivated grain on volcanic soils, where skilled metalworkers transformed copper and tin into bronze with techniques that rivaled the greatest craftsmen of their age. The Mediterranean of the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ was not an empty landscape, waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already filled with thriving communities connected through trade routes stretching from Anatolia to the Balkans, from the islands of the Aegean to the shores of Italy and beyond. Among these communities lived the people whom later generations would remember as the Pelasgians. Understanding them requires leaving behind many modern assumptions about the ancient world. The familiar image of ancient Greece often begins with famous philosophers, magnificent temples, democratic assemblies, and legendary warriors. Yet those achievements did not emerge from nothing. Every civilization inherits knowledge from those who came before it. Roads follow older paths. Cities rise upon earlier settlements. Sacred places remain sacred long after the original worshippers disappear. Languages borrow words from older tongues. Religious customs survive even after the names of the original gods have been forgotten. The Pelasgians seem to belong to this deeper layer of Mediterranean history. The earliest literary references appear in the poems traditionally attributed to Homer. Although these epics were written centuries after the events they described, They preserve memories that likely originated in much older oral traditions. In the Iliad, the Pelasgians appear not as mysterious strangers, but as active participants in the conflict surrounding Troy. They fight alongside the Trojans against the Achaean armies. Their homeland is described as fertile Larissa. Their leaders are named Hippothous and Pyleus, sons of Lethus. These are not vague references. Homer treats them as a recognizable people with their own territory, commanders, and military identity. That detail is significant. It suggests that by the time these traditions were taking shape, memories of Pelasgian communities remained strong enough to preserve specific names and locations. Whether every detail reflects historical reality cannot be known with certainty. Epic poetry combines history, memory, and artistic tradition. Yet it rarely invents entire peoples without reason. When Homer names the Pelasgians among the allies of Troy, he reflects traditions already considered ancient in his own time. The Iliad presents them as capable warriors equipped with bronze weapons. They occupy valuable agricultural lands. Their position within the Trojan alliance indicates political organization rather than scattered tribal existence. They appear as one among many established powers participating in the struggles that shaped the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The Odyssey offers another fascinating glimpse. There, the Pelasgians are listed among the peoples living on Crete together with Achaeans, Dorians, Sidonians, and Edo-Cretans. This simple passage has generated centuries of discussion. If the Pelasgians lived both near Troy and on Crete, then they were clearly not confined to one isolated region. Instead, they may have formed a widespread cultural presence extending across much of the Aegean world. Whether they represented one ethnic group or several related populations remains uncertain. Ancient writers themselves often disagreed. Some described them as the original inhabitants of Greece. Others connected them with islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. Still others believe they had once occupied vast territories before gradually giving way to Greek-speaking peoples. What makes these traditions especially intriguing is how often they align with archaeological discoveries made thousands of years later. During the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began uncovering settlements beneath later Greek cities. Layer after layer revealed civilizations older than classical Greece. Some of these settlements displayed cultural traditions unlike those associated with later Mycenaean Greeks. Different pottery styles appeared. Different architectural methods emerged. Different burial customs became visible. None of these discoveries came with labels identifying their inhabitants. Archaeology cannot simply uncover a stone saying, "This city belonged to the Pelasgians." Instead, researchers must compare material evidence with literary traditions. The process is careful, sometimes frustrating, often uncertain, yet occasionally the pieces fit together in remarkable ways. One of the most important locations in this investigation is the island of Lemnos. Positioned strategically in the northern Aegean, Lemnos controlled sea routes connecting Anatolia with mainland Greece. Its fertile volcanic soil supported agriculture. Its natural harbors welcomed ships traveling between major trading centers. Its location made it both prosperous and strategically valuable. Excavations revealed that Lemnos had been inhabited continuously for for thousands of years. Among its long before the names of Athens, Sparta, or even classical Greece echoed across the Mediterranean, another people occupied the landscapes that would later become the heart of Greek civilization. Their story survives only in fragments. No king left behind a grand chronicle in their own language that historians can read with certainty. No empire carved its history into endless walls of stone describing every victory and every defeat. Instead, what remains is something far more intriguing. A handful of ancient writers remembered them. Archaeological discoveries quietly revealed traces of their lives beneath layers of earth. Ancient place names refused to disappear even after entire cultures had faded away. Forgotten languages left mysterious echoes in inscriptions that scholars still debate today. These scattered clues form the outline of a civilization that stood at the crossroads between myth and history. That civilization is known as the Pelasgians. Even today, after generations of archaeological excavations and historical research, they remain among the most debated peoples of the ancient Mediterranean. Who exactly were they? Were they a single nation? Were they many related communities sharing similar customs? Or was the word Pelasgian simply the label later Greeks used whenever they encountered ruins older than themselves and traditions whose true origins had already been forgotten? These questions have fascinated historians for centuries. Every generation has attempted to solve the mystery. Every new excavation adds another piece to the puzzle. Yet each answer often creates new questions. Unlike civilizations such as Egypt, Assyria, or Babylon, whose histories survive in thousands of written records, the Pelasgians must be reconstructed through careful comparison between archaeology, linguistics, ancient literature, and environmental evidence. Each discipline reveals only part of the picture. Only when these pieces are examined together does a remarkable story begin to emerge. It is a story that begins thousands of years before the classical age. It begins in a world where the coastlines of the Aegean were already busy with merchants and sailors, where fortified settlements overlooked fertile valleys, where farmers cultivated grain on volcanic soils, where skilled metalworkers transformed copper and tin into bronze with techniques that rivaled the greatest craftsmen of their age. The Mediterranean of the 3rd and 2nd millennia before Christ was not an empty landscape, waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already filled with thriving communities connected through trade routes stretching from Anatolia to the Balkans, from the islands of the Aegean to the shores of Italy and beyond. Among these communities lived the people whom later generations would remember as the Pelasgians. Understanding them requires leaving behind many modern assumptions about the ancient world. The familiar image of ancient Greece often begins with famous philosophers, magnificent temples, democratic assemblies, and legendary warriors. Yet those achievements did not emerge from nothing. Every civilization inherits knowledge from those who came before it. Roads follow older paths. Cities rise upon earlier settlements. Sacred places remain sacred long after the original worshippers disappear. Languages borrow words from older tongues. Religious customs survive even after the names of the original gods have been forgotten. The Pelasgians seem to belong to this deeper layer of Mediterranean history. The earliest literary references appear in the poems traditionally attributed to Homer. Although these epics were written centuries after the events they describe, they preserve memories that likely originated in much older oral traditions. In the Iliad, the Pelasgians appear not as mysterious strangers, but as active participants in the conflict surrounding Troy. They fight alongside the Trojans against the Achaean armies. Their homeland is described as fertile Larissa. Their leaders are named Hippothous and Pyleus, sons of Lethus. These are not vague references. Homer treats them as a recognizable people with their own territory, commanders, and military identity. That detail is significant. It suggests that by the time these traditions were taking shape, memories of Pelasgian communities remained strong enough to preserve specific names and locations. Whether every detail reflects historical reality cannot be known with certainty. Epic poetry combines history, memory, and artistic tradition. Yet it rarely invents entire peoples without reason. When Homer names the Pelasgians among the allies of Troy, he reflects traditions already considered ancient in his own time. The Iliad presents them as capable warriors equipped with bronze weapons. They occupy valuable agricultural lands. Their position within the Trojan alliance indicates political organization rather than scattered tribal existence. They appear as one among many established powers participating in the struggles that shaped the late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. The Odyssey offers another fascinating glimpse. There, the Pelasgians are listed among the peoples living on Crete together with Achaeans, Dorians, Sidonians, and Eteocretans. This simple passage has generated centuries of discussion. If the Pelasgians lived both near Troy and on Crete, then they were clearly not confined to one isolated region. Instead, they may have formed a widespread cultural presence extending across much of the Aegean world. Whether they represented one ethnic group or several related populations remains uncertain. Ancient writers themselves often disagreed. Some described them as the original inhabitants of Greece. Others connected them with islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. Still others believe they had once occupied vast territories before gradually giving way to Greek-speaking peoples. What makes these traditions especially intriguing is how often they align with archaeological discoveries made thousands of years later. During the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists began uncovering settlements beneath later Greek cities. Layer after layer revealed civilizations older than classical Greece. Some of these settlements displayed cultural traditions unlike those associated with later Mycenaean Greeks. Different pottery styles appeared. Different architectural methods emerged. Different burial customs became visible. None of these discoveries came with labels identifying their inhabitants. Archaeology cannot simply uncover a stone saying, "This city belonged to the Pelasgians." Instead, researchers must compare material evidence with literary traditions. The process is careful, sometimes frustrating, often uncertain, yet occasionally the pieces fit together in remarkable ways. One of the most important locations in this investigation is the island of Lemnos. Positioned strategically in the northern Aegean, Lemnos controlled sea routes connecting Anatolia with mainland Greece. Its fertile volcanic soil supported agriculture. Its natural harbors welcomed ships traveling between major trading centers. Its location made it both prosperous and strategically valuable. Excavations revealed that Lemnos had been inhabited continuously for thousands of years. Among its most remarkable archaeological sites stands Polyakni. Today it appears as silent ruins overlooking the sea. 5,000 years ago, it was something entirely different. It was one of Europe's earliest urban settlements. Its inhabitants constructed substantial defensive walls. They organized residential districts. They established storage facilities capable of supporting large populations. Craft production flourished within the settlement. Trade linked the community with distant regions. This was not an isolated village struggling for survival. It was an organized urban society displaying remarkable sophistication. Its stone fortifications reveal advanced engineering. Builders selected volcanic basalt with extraordinary care. Massive blocks were fitted together precisely. The walls enclosed the settlement while taking advantage of the natural terrain. Entrances were carefully designed to strengthen defense. The people responsible understood architecture not simply as construction, but as strategy. Inside these defenses, homes varied greatly in size. Some were relatively modest. Others contained multiple rooms surrounding central courtyards. Such differences suggest varying levels of wealth and social status. Complex societies rarely emerge overnight. They develop gradually through generations of organization, specialization, and accumulated knowledge. Evidence from Polyakni points toward exactly such development. Pottery recovered from the site tells another part of the story. Its forms differ noticeably from later Mycenaean ceramics. Decoration follows different artistic traditions. Manufacturing techniques display independent evolution rather than simple imitation. These distinctions matter because pottery often reflects cultural identity more consistently than many other archaeological remains. Styles may spread through trade, but long-established manufacturing traditions frequently preserve local customs across centuries. The ceramics from Lemnos therefore hint at communities maintaining identities distinct from those of later Greek settlers. Trade, however, connected them to the wider Mediterranean. Imported materials reached the island. Local products traveled outward. Bronze tools, ornaments, and vessels demonstrate participation in commercial networks stretching far beyond the horizon visible from Lemnos itself. The inhabitants were never isolated. They belonged to a dynamic maritime world where ideas moved alongside goods. Religious life formed another essential part of this society. Archaeological discoveries reveal sanctuaries unlike the monumental temples familiar from classical Greece. Instead of grand colonnades, sacred spaces often centered around natural features. Groves, springs, roque formation, open-air ritual areas. This pattern appears repeatedly across sites associated with pre-Greek populations. Nature itself occupied the center of worship. The divine was experienced through landscapes rather than enclosed within monumental architecture. Such traditions would leave surprisingly deep marks upon later Greek religion. Many sanctuaries that became famous during classical times stand atop sites already sacred centuries earlier. Religious continuity often outlasts political change. New peoples adopt old holy places. They reinterpret them. They rename the gods. Yet the locations themselves remain sacred generation after generation. Perhaps nowhere illustrates this continuity more clearly than Dodona and Epirus. Long before marble temples rose there, the site appears to have functioned as a center of religious activity. Instead of priests delivering elaborate speeches, divine messages were believed to emerge from the natural world itself. The rustling leaves of sacred oak trees carried meaning. The sounds produced by bronze objects hanging from branches became signs requiring interpretation. Birds moving through the grove formed another language understood by trained religious specialists. These practices differ significantly from many later Greek rituals. They suggest theological concepts rooted deeply in earlier traditions. Ancient authors themselves believed Dodona possessed Pelagian origins. Modern archaeology cannot fully confirm every ancient story, but Bronze Age remains beneath later construction demonstrate that the sanctuary's sacred history extends far beyond the classical period. As excavations continued across the Aegean, another extraordinary discovery changed the debate forever. In 1885, workers on Lemnos uncovered a stone monument now known as the Lemnian stele. Its importance became apparent almost immediately. The inscription carved upon it did not resemble ordinary Greek writing. Although its alphabet showed similarities to scripts used elsewhere around the Mediterranean, the language itself appeared entirely different. Scholars eventually recognized striking parallels with Etruscan, the language once spoken in ancient Italy. That observation opened one of the most fascinating discussions in Mediterranean archaeology. Could populations living in the Aegean and central Italy once have shared linguistic ancestry? Did ancient migration connect these distant regions? Or had a broader family of related languages once stretched across much of the Mediterranean before later Indo-European languages gradually replaced them? Even today, no complete consensus exists. Yet the Lemnian inscription provides undeniable evidence for the existence of a non-Greek language surviving on the island during the early first millennium before Christ. That single artifact transformed speculation into tangible evidence. For the first time, researchers possessed direct testimony that populations unlike the Greeks continued living in parts of the Aegean well into historical times. The inscription itself remains only partly understood. Many words resist confident translation. Some grammatical patterns resemble Etruscan remarkably closely. Others remain unique. Each proposed interpretation generates further debate. Every new linguistic study offers another possibility while reminding scholars how much remains unknown. Ironically, the mystery itself has become one of the strongest pieces of evidence. If all pre-Greek populations had disappeared long before historical times, such inscriptions would never have survived. Instead, Lemnos demonstrates cultural persistence. Ancient identities endured far longer than once believed. Their voices reached us only faintly, but they reached us nonetheless. The story of the Pelagians, therefore, does not begin with disappearance. It begins with presence, with thriving settlements, with trade, with engineering, with religious traditions, with languages now almost entirely lost. Long before classical Greece entered history, these communities had already helped shape the world that later generations would inherit. To understand how ancient historians remembered them, and why writers such as Herodotus believe the Pelasgians were the earliest inhabitants of Greece, we must now turn from the archaeological record to the testimony of the classical authors themselves. When Greek historians began writing about the distant past, they faced the same challenge that historians face today. They inherited traditions that were already ancient. They listened to local stories preserved by generations of priests, travelers, and community elders. They observed monuments whose builders had long since vanished. They encountered place names that no longer made sense in the Greek language. Instead of complete historical records, they worked with fragments. Among the peoples who appeared again and again within those fragments were the Pelasgians. No ancient historian devoted an entire work exclusively to them. Instead, they emerged repeatedly in discussions about the earliest history of Greece, the origins of cities, the foundations of sanctuaries, and the arrival of Greek-speaking peoples. Each writer preserved part of the picture. Each approached the subject with different goals. Together, their accounts became the foundation upon which nearly every later discussion of the Pelasgians has been built. The most influential voice belongs to Herodotus. Writing during the 5th century before Christ, he traveled widely across the eastern Mediterranean, gathering traditions from priests, local officials, merchants, and ordinary inhabitants. His work combined direct observation with stories passed down through generations. Modern historians recognize that not every account he recorded can be accepted as literal history. Yet his willingness to preserve multiple traditions has also protected information that would otherwise have disappeared forever. For Herodotus, the Pelasgians represented something fundamental. They were not simply another neighboring people. They belonged to the deepest layer of Greece's past. Again and again, he described them as inhabitants of lands that later became famous Greek territories. Before Athenians dominated Attica, before the great city-states reached the height of their influence, before Greek identity became firmly established. According to Herodotus, Pelasgian communities already lived there. One of his most discussed observations concerns language. He remarks that Pelasgians who still survive in his own lifetime spoke a language different from Greek. This statement has attracted enormous scholarly attention. It suggests that at least some communities preserved their linguistic identity centuries after Greek-speaking populations had spread across the region. Herodotus does not provide a vocabulary list. He offers no grammar. He records no detailed conversations. Yet his simple observation carries enormous historical importance. If accurate, it means that cultural diversity continued to characterize parts of the Aegean long after the rise of Greek civilization. Modern archaeology provides intriguing support for this possibility. The Lemnian inscription demonstrates that at least one non-Greek language survived in the northern Aegean during the early first millennium before Christ. Whether that language belonged specifically to people called Pelasgians remains uncertain. But it confirms that Herodotus was not imagining a completely homogeneous Greek-speaking world. Other languages truly did exist alongside Greek. Herodotus also connects the Pelasgians with Attica itself. Before Athens became the political and cultural center of classical Greece, he believed Pelasgian populations occupied parts of the region. They lived near the Acropolis. They cultivated the surrounding countryside. Some traditions even credited them with constructing defensive works around early settlements. Ancient Athenians themselves preserved memories of these earlier inhabitants. Those memories were not always positive. Some stories portrayed cooperation. Others described conflict. Still others attempted to explain why the Pelasgians eventually disappeared from Attica altogether. According to one tradition recorded by Herodotus, the Athenians originally welcomed Pelasgian communities because of their usefulness as builders. The newcomers were said to have worked on fortifications and public construction projects. Later, however, relations deteriorated. Ancient explanations differ regarding the reasons. Some accounts blame political disputes. Others suggest social tensions. Still others include legendary details that modern historians treat cautiously. Whatever the precise historical reality, the tradition reflects something important. It preserves the memory of interaction rather than simple replacement. The Pelasgians were remembered as participants in early Athenian history rather than imaginary figures existing outside it. Herodotus also pays particular attention to Lemnos. Here his narrative becomes more concrete. He describes Pelasgian communities settling on the island after leaving Attica. There they established independent settlements and maintained their own customs. The island's strategic position enabled them to participate in maritime trade while preserving a distinct identity. Again, archaeology offers intriguing parallels. Excavations confirm that Lemnos possessed thriving settlements long before classical Greek colonization. Distinctive material culture continued there into periods that overlap with historical traditions. The famous Lemnian inscription further strengthens the picture of cultural persistence. Although archaeology cannot confirm every event described by Herodotus, the broader pattern proves remarkably consistent. Another major source comes from Thucydides. Unlike Herodotus, Thucydides focused primarily on the political and military events of his own age. His approach to history emphasized critical analysis, direct observation, and careful evaluation of evidence. References to the Pelasgians occupy only a small part of his work. Yet those references remain highly significant. Thucydides discusses them mainly in connection with the earliest development of Attica. He describes Pelasgian communities living in districts that later became central to Athenian territory. Rather than portraying them as wandering tribes, he presents them as organized populations occupying established settlements. His account emphasizes long-term coexistence between Pelasgians and Greeks. Conflict certainly occurred. Competition over land and political influence gradually intensified. But the process unfolded across generations rather than through one dramatic invasion. This gradual picture aligns closely with what archaeologists increasingly observe in the material record. Excavated settlements often reveal continuity rather than abrupt destruction. Pottery styles evolve gradually. Architectural traditions overlap. Burial customs blend older and newer elements. Such evidence rarely supports simple narratives of total replacement. Instead, it suggests communities adapting to changing social conditions while preserving parts of their earlier identities. Thucydides also illustrates another important aspect of historical memory. For him, the Pelasgians belonged to the background of Greek political development. They represented the populations present before Athens reached prominence. Their story mattered because it explained how political authority evolved over time. In that sense, Pelasgian history became inseparable from the origins of the Greek world itself. Centuries later, another traveler added valuable observations. Pausanias journeyed across Greece during the Roman period, carefully recording temples, monuments, sanctuaries, and local traditions. Unlike earlier historians writing closer to the events they described, Pausanias encountered landscapes already layered with centuries of history. Many communities still remembered ancient stories explaining the origins of nearby ruins. Again and again, enormous stone walls attracted his attention. Local inhabitants often attributed these structures to peoples who lived before the Greeks. Among the names most frequently associated with such monuments were the Pelasgians. Modern archaeologists recognize that these walls belong to different periods and cultures. Some are Mycenaean, others date even earlier. Ancient attributions, therefore, cannot always be accepted literally, yet they reveal something equally valuable. By Roman times, memories of pre-Greek builders remained deeply rooted in local tradition. Communities continued connecting impressive prehistoric architecture with the mysterious people remembered as Pelasgians. Pausanias also preserved traditions concerning sanctuaries believed to have ancient origins. Many sacred places maintained stories that their earliest rituals had begun before the arrival of Greek-speaking populations. These traditions cannot always be verified archaeologically. Yet excavations frequently uncover Bronze Age activity beneath later temples. The pattern appears often enough to demand serious attention. Rather than inventing sacred origins entirely from imagination, local traditions may have preserved genuine memories extending back over many centuries. Strabo approached the subject from yet another perspective. Writing during the early Roman Empire, he sought to describe the geography of the known world while integrating historical traditions into his explanations. For Strabo, the Pelasgians appeared across a surprisingly broad geographic area. He associated them with mainland Greece, with the islands of the Aegean, with regions of Anatolia, even with traditions extending toward Italy. Modern scholarship debates whether these references describe one people or multiple groups remembered under common name. Strabo himself acknowledged that ancient opinions differed considerably. His willingness to preserve conflicting traditions reflects the uncertainty that already existed in antiquity. By his own lifetime, the Pelasgians belonged to a past so distant that even educated scholars struggled to define them precisely. Another recurring theme within classical literature concerns architecture. Massive stone fortifications fascinated ancient observers. Walls built from enormous blocks seemed almost beyond human ability. Because later generations no longer remembered the identities of the original builders, extraordinary explanations naturally emerged. Some attributed such works to Cyclopes. Others associated them with Pelasgians. Today, archaeologists prefer more precise dating methods. Radiocarbon analysis, ceramic chronology, architectural comparison. These techniques reveal that many megalithic structures belong to the Bronze Age. Although direct attribution remains difficult, ancient traditions correctly recognized one important fact. These fortifications were already ancient long before classical Greece reached its height. Language provides another fascinating area where literary tradition intersects with archaeology. Classical writers repeatedly mention place names that they considered older than Greek itself. Many towns, rivers, and mountains retain names that resisted explanation through the Greek language. Even ancient scholars noticed the problem. Some attempted imaginative etymologies. Others simply accepted that these names belonged to earlier populations. Modern linguistics reaches similar conclusions, though with more systematic methods. Across Greece appear numerous place names ending in forms such as "-sos", "-thos", and similar suffixes that likely originated before Indo-European Greek became dominant. Famous examples include Corinth, Parnassus, and Knossos. Not every such name necessarily belongs to Pelasgian languages. Several different pre-Greek languages may once have existed, yet together they demonstrate a profound linguistic truth. Greek speakers inherited landscapes already named by earlier inhabitants. River names provide particularly valuable evidence because they tend to survive population change. Throughout history, conquering peoples frequently rename cities. Rivers prove more resistant. Communities continue using familiar names generation after generation. Across Greece, many major rivers preserve names with uncertain Greek origins. Some scholars believe they represent linguistic fossils reaching back into the Bronze Age or even earlier. Ancient historians could not analyze these names scientifically, but they recognized their antiquity. When they attributed such names to Pelasgians or other early peoples, they reflected observations that modern research continues investigating. Of course, ancient historians were not modern archaeologists. They lacked excavation techniques. They possessed no radiocarbon dating. They could not compare DNA evidence or conduct isotope analysis. Their understanding depended upon oral tradition, observation, and reasoning. Sometimes they preserved authentic historical memory. Sometimes they repeated legends. Sometimes both became inseparably intertwined. This mixture presents one of the greatest challenges facing modern historians. Rejecting every ancient tradition would discard valuable evidence. Accepting every story literally would ignore centuries of myth-making. The most reliable approach compares independent lines of evidence, where literature, archaeology, linguistics, and environmental data point towards similar conclusions. Confidence naturally increases. Remarkably, this is exactly what often happens with the Pelasgians. Ancient writers describe populations existing before widespread Greek settlement. Archaeology confirms sophisticated pre-Greek communities across the Aegean. Classical authors mention non-Greek languages. The Lemnian inscription proves at least one such language survived into historical times. Ancient traditions connect important sanctuaries with pre-Greek worship. Excavations repeatedly uncover Bronze Age religious activity beneath later Greek temples. None of these observations proves every literary detail. Taken together, however, they paint an increasingly coherent picture. The Pelasgians were not simply inventions created to explain mysterious ruins. Ancient memory appears to preserve echoes of real populations who contributed significantly to the cultural foundations of the Aegean world. As historians continue comparing texts with excavated evidence, The mystery becomes not whether pre-Greek civilizations existed, but how their achievements shaped the civilization that would eventually become known as ancient Greece. That question leads directly to one of the most remarkable places in the entire Aegean, where archaeology has uncovered evidence unlike almost anywhere else, and where one extraordinary inscription continues to reshape our understanding of the ancient Mediterranean. Among all the places connected with the Pelasgians, one island stands above the rest. Its landscape is shaped by ancient volcanic forces. Its hills overlook some of the busiest sea routes of the ancient world. Its fertile plains supported prosperous communities long before the rise of classical Greece. And beneath its soil, archaeologists uncover discoveries that forced historians to rethink the earliest history of the Aegean. That island is Lemnos. Located in the northern Aegean Sea, Lemnos occupies a strategic position between the coast of Anatolia and mainland Greece. Any vessel sailing through the northeastern Aegean would have recognized its importance. Ships traveling toward the Hellespont could stop there. Merchants crossing between eastern and western Mediterranean markets could anchor in its natural harbors. Its location alone made it valuable. Its resources made it even more attractive. The island's volcanic origin enriched its soil. Agriculture flourished. Grain grew successfully. Olive trees found favorable conditions. Pastures supported livestock. Freshwater source supplied permanent settlement. Unlike many smaller islands that depended heavily upon imported food, Lemnos possessed the ability to sustain relatively large populations. That stability encouraged long-term settlement. Generation after generation built upon the work of those who came before them. Over thousands of years, villages expanded into organized communities. Communities gradually evolved into substantial settlements. By the third millennium before Christ, one settlement in particular had reached a remarkable level of development. Today, it is known as Poliokni. To modern visitors, its stone foundations appear quiet beneath the Mediterranean sun. Yet, during the Bronze Age, it was among the most advanced urban centers in Europe. Long before the construction of the Parthenon, long before the emergence of classical Athens, long before Greek philosophers debated politics and science, the inhabitants of Poliokni were already designing streets, constructing defenses, organizing neighborhoods, and participating in international trade. Excavations have revealed that the settlement expanded through multiple phases rather than appearing suddenly. Each generation modified existing buildings. New walls replaced older ones. Homes grew larger. Public spaces became more organized. Infrastructure improved over time. This steady development reflects stability rather than constant disruption. The people living there possessed the ability to plan for future generations. One of the most impressive features discovered at the site is its defensive system. Massive stone walls surrounded the settlement. These were not hastily assembled barriers. Their builders carefully selected suitable stone. Individual blocks were shaped where necessary. Each section was designed to work together with the surrounding landscape. Entrances remained limited and defensible. Approaching attackers would have encountered carefully controlled access points rather than broad openings. The construction itself demonstrates considerable engineering skill. Even today, many sections remain recognizable despite thousands of years of erosion and human activity. Within the walls, archaeologists identified neighborhoods organized with surprising consistency. Buildings served different purposes. Some appear to have been ordinary family homes. Others likely functioned as storage facilities. Certain structures stand out because of their size and internal arrangement. These may have served administrative or communal functions. While researchers continue debating their precise roles, one conclusion remains difficult to dispute. The settlement displayed planning. This was not a random collection of houses built wherever space happened to exist. Its layout reflects organized decision-making. Differences between houses also reveal important clues about society itself. Some residences contained multiple rooms arranged around central courtyards. Others were considerably smaller. The variation suggests unequal access to wealth and resources. In other words, social hierarchy already existed. Certain individuals or families enjoyed greater prosperity than others. Such inequality often accompanies increasing political organization and economic specialization. Craft production became another defining characteristic of the settlement. Archaeologists recovered large quantities of pottery representing generations of ceramic development. These vessels performed practical functions. They stored grain. They carried liquids. They served food. They accompanied religious rituals. Yet beyond their usefulness, they reveal extraordinary technical ability. Potters selected clay with care. They controlled firing temperatures successfully. Surface treatments varied according to intended use. Decorative patterns demonstrate consistency across workshops while allowing room for individual creativity. Certain designs appear repeatedly throughout the settlement. Geometric motifs dominate many vessels. Straight lines intersect with curves. Bands encircle the body of the pot. Incised decorations catch the light in distinctive ways. Unlike later Greek painted pottery famous for mythological scenes, these earlier ceramics often emphasize abstract visual balance. Their beauty lies in rhythm rather than storytelling. Every completed vessel reflects both artistic taste and practical experience accumulated over centuries. Pottery also provides archaeologists with one of their most reliable chronological tools. Styles evolve gradually. Shapes change over time. Decorative habits spread between neighboring communities. By comparing ceramics from different sites, researchers reconstruct ancient patterns of contact and exchange. The pottery from Poliokni reveals extensive interaction with settlements across the Aegean and Western Anatolia. Ideas moved across the sea alongside people and goods. Metalworking reached equally impressive levels. Bronze tools recovered from the site include knives, chisels, axes, awls, and other implements essential for daily life. Creating bronze required more than simple craftsmanship. Copper and tin rarely occur together naturally. Communities therefore needed access to distant trade networks capable of supplying raw materials from different regions. After obtaining those materials, metalworkers had to understand alloy composition. Too much tin made bronze brittle. Too little reduced its hardness. Producing reliable tools require experience passed from one generation to the next. Evidence from Lemnos suggests exactly such accumulated expertise. Finished objects reveal careful casting. Many were subsequently shaped, sharpened, and polished. Some decorative items display remarkable elegance despite their age. Bracelets, pins, ornaments. Each object reflects both technical ability and aesthetic judgment. The presence of specialized workshops further suggests that certain individuals devoted much of their lives to particular crafts. Economic specialization had clearly become part of community life. Agriculture remained the foundation supporting this prosperity. Storage facilities uncovered throughout the settlement indicate systematic collection and preservation of food supplies. Large storage jars stood ready to protect grain against moisture and pests. Communities capable of accumulating surplus food gained important advantages. They could survive poor harvests more effectively. They could support craftsmen who no longer needed to farm full-time. They could participate in trade from a position of strength. Such surplus often marks an important stage in the growth of complex societies. Trade connected Lemnos with a remarkably wide world. Imported materials discovered by archaeologists demonstrate regular contact with neighboring regions. Certain pottery styles originated elsewhere before reaching the island. Raw materials arrived from distant sources. Finished goods traveled outward in return. The sea served not as a barrier, but as a highway linking communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. This maritime world operated centuries before the great naval powers of classical Greece emerged. Sailors already understood seasonal winds. They recognized safe anchorages. They navigated between islands, using accumulated practical knowledge passed through generations. Every successful voyage strengthened commercial relationships and encouraged cultural exchange. Religious life also occupied an important place within these communities. Unlike the monumental temples familiar from later Greek architecture, Bronze Age sacred spaces often appear more closely integrated with the natural environment. Archaeologists discovered evidence of ritual activity associated with open areas, altars, and special deposits of offerings. Small figurines appear among these discoveries. So do carefully placed ceramic vessels. Bronze objects deposited intentionally rather than discarded suggest ceremonial use. Although the beliefs behind these practices cannot be reconstructed in complete detail, the archaeological evidence leaves little doubt that religion formed a central element of community life. One of the most extraordinary discoveries connected with Lemnos did not emerge from a grand palace or monumental sanctuary. Instead, it came from a single stone monument found near the village of Kaminia during the 19th century. Known today as the Lemnian stele, it immediately attracted scholarly attention. The inscription carved upon its surface looked familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Its alphabet resembled writing systems already known from parts of the Mediterranean. Yet the language itself resisted identification. As specialists studied the text more closely, unexpected similarities emerged between its vocabulary and the language of the Etruscans in ancient Italy. This observation astonished researchers. The Etruscans occupied central Italy. Lemnos lies in the northeastern Aegean. The distance between them is considerable. How could languages spoken in these regions display meaningful similarities? The question remains actively debated. Some scholars argue that both belong to a broader language family now largely extinct. Others propose ancient movements of people across the Mediterranean. Still others emphasize caution, noting that similarities alone cannot fully reconstruct prehistoric migrations. Although archaeologists continue debating the precise function of every structure, the broader picture is unmistakable. This was an organized society capable of long-term planning. Pottery recovered from Dimini reveals another layer of cultural sophistication. Its decorative traditions differ in important ways from those associated with later Mycenaean Greece. Many vessels display burnished surfaces carefully polished until they reflected light with remarkable smoothness. Others feature geometric designs cut into the clay before firing. Certain forms appear consistently across multiple settlements throughout Thessaly, suggesting shared artistic traditions extending beyond individual villages. These similarities indicate regular communication between communities. Ideas traveled, craft techniques spread, regional identities gradually formed. At the same time, local differences remained visible. Each settlement retained subtle variations in style, reflecting generations of independent development. The archaeological evidence, therefore, suggests neither complete isolation nor complete uniformity. Instead, Thessaly appears as part of a wider cultural network linked by exchange while preserving local traditions. Agriculture stood at the center of everyday life. The fertile plains supported wheat and barley cultivation. Livestock grazed across surrounding pastures. Seasonal rhythms determined much of community life. Planting, harvesting, storage, preparation for winter. Every successful harvest strengthened the settlement. Every poor season tested its resilience. Archaeologists have recovered grinding stones worn smooth through countless hours of preparing grain. Bronze sickles testify to harvesting techniques refined over generations. Large storage vessels reveal careful planning for the future. Survival depended not merely upon producing food, but upon preserving it successfully. The importance of storage cannot be overstated. Communities capable of maintaining reserves gained tremendous advantages. Surplus grain supported population growth. It allowed some individuals to specialize as potters, smiths, builders, or traders instead of farming full-time. Economic diversity gradually encouraged technological innovation. Innovation, in turn, strengthened the community even further. Across Thessaly, settlement patterns reveal thoughtful adaptation to the landscape. Villages often occupied slightly elevated ground overlooking nearby fields. Such locations balanced several practical concerns at once. Floodwaters posed less danger. Defensive visibility improved. Agricultural land remained close enough for efficient cultivation. Access to fresh water remained essential. The relationship between people and landscape was carefully managed rather than accidental. Ancient traditions repeatedly associate another name with the Pelasgians, Larissa. To modern readers, it may seem simply the name of a city. In reality, the name appears in several different locations across the Greek world. That repetition has fascinated historians for centuries. Some scholars suggest the word itself may derive from a pre-Greek language. Others propose that it referred generally to a fortified settlement or citadel before later becoming attached to individual cities. Absolute certainty remains impossible. Yet the repeated appearance of the name in regions associated with ancient Pelasgian traditions remains difficult to ignore. Place names often survive astonishing lengths of time. Empires rise and fall. Languages change. Political boundaries shift. Yet familiar names continue passing from one generation to the next. For this reason, linguists pay close attention to ancient toponyms. Throughout Greece appear names whose origins cannot be explained through Greek alone. Some contain endings unlike ordinary Greek word formation. Others preserve sounds that fit poorly within Indo-European linguistic patterns. Rather than treating these names as meaningless curiosities, modern scholarship increasingly views them as valuable historical evidence. They may preserve echoes of languages spoken before Greek became dominant. River names prove especially important. Across the world, rivers frequently retain their oldest names despite repeated changes in political control. Communities settling beside an already named river often adopt the existing name rather than inventing a completely new one. In Greece, several major rivers possess names that resist convincing Greek explanation. The Peneios in Thessaly, the Cephissus in central Greece, the Spercheios farther south. Whether each originated specifically in a Pelasgian language cannot be demonstrated. Different pre-Greek languages may once have existed. Nevertheless, these names collectively remind us that the landscape itself preserves memories older than written history. Religion also left enduring traces. Throughout Thessaly and neighboring regions, archaeological excavations have uncovered sanctuaries predating classical Greek temples. Many occupy locations chosen because of striking natural features. Springs emerging from hillsides, caves penetrating deep into limestone mountains, ancient trees dominating open landscapes, rock formations visible from great distances. Such places inspired reverence long before monumental architecture transformed them into formal sanctuaries. One recurring pattern deserves particular attention. Early sacred places often emphasized direct interaction with the natural environment. Water, stone, trees, the earth itself. These elements appear repeatedly within Bronze Age ritual contexts. Later Greek religion frequently inherited the same locations while introducing new myths and divine names. The sacred place endured even as theology evolved. This continuity becomes especially important when considering the Oracle of Dodona. Although located in Epirus rather than Thessaly, it reflects religious ideas widespread across northwestern Greece. Ancient tradition consistently regarded Dodona as one of the oldest sanctuaries in the Greek world. Long before impressive temples appeared there, worship centered upon a sacred oak grove. Instead of consulting elaborate statues or enclosed shrines, worshippers listened for divine messages carried by the natural world. The movement of leaves, the voices of birds, the sound produced by bronze objects suspended among the branches. Nature itself became the medium through which divine was understood. Archaeological evidence confirms that religious activity at Dodona extends far back into the Bronze Age. Excavations beneath later structures uncovered earlier deposits containing pottery, metal objects, and traces of ritual activity. These discoveries cannot identify the names of the earliest worshippers. They do, however, demonstrate that the site's sacred significance long predates the classical Greek sanctuary described by later writers. Such continuity strengthens the possibility that ancient traditions preserving memories of pre-Greek worship contain genuine historical foundations. Architecture offers another fascinating line of evidence. Across mainland Greece stand fortifications built from enormous blocks of stone. Later Greeks admired these structures, but often doubted ordinary humans could have constructed them. Legends attributed some to the Cyclopes. Others became associated with peoples remembered before the Greeks, including the Pelasgians. Today, archaeologists analyze these walls through scientific methods rather than mythology. Construction techniques reveal considerable engineering skill. Builders carefully selected massive stones. Each block was shaped only where necessary. Natural irregularities helped neighboring stones lock together securely. The resulting walls remained standing after thousands of years without mortar. Such achievements required planning rather than brute strength alone. Quarries had to be organized, transport methods developed, labor coordinated, knowledge passed from experienced builders to younger generations. Wherever these techniques appear, they testify to societies possessing significant organizational capacity. One remarkable example comes from the site of GLA in Boeotia, built upon a rocky outcrop overlooking what was once Lake Capes. The fortified enclosure covers an enormous area. Its walls stretch across the landscape with extraordinary confidence. Although scholars debate every aspect of its political history, few question the engineering ability required for its construction. Whether or not communities remembered later as Pelasgian participated directly, monuments such as GLA remind us that pre-classical Greece possessed architectural traditions of remarkable sophistication. Daily life within these settlements depended upon more than agriculture alone. Craft production flourished. Bronze smiths fashioned tools, weapons, and ornaments. Potters supplied households with practical vessels. Textile production occupied many families. Spindle whorls recovered during excavation reveal the importance of spinning thread. Loom weights testify to weaving. Clothing required enormous labor long before modern manufacturing existed. Every garment represented countless hours of work, beginning with raw fibers and ending in finished fabric. Trade connected these inland communities with the wider Mediterranean. Objects fashioned from materials unavailable locally appear within archaeological deposits. Marine shells reached inland settlements. Metal ores traveled considerable distances. Finished goods moved alongside raw materials. Merchants exchanged more than products. They carried ideas. Artistic style spread. Technological knowledge crossed mountains and seas. Religious concepts traveled with them. The mainland, therefore, cannot be understood in isolation. Its communities formed part of an interconnected Bronze Age world extending across the Aegean and beyond. As archaeologists compare discoveries from Thessaly, Boeotia, the Peloponnese, Anatolia, and the islands, a consistent picture emerges. Long before classical Greece, numerous sophisticated societies already occupied these landscapes. They built impressive settlements. developed advanced craft traditions, maintained extensive exchange networks, created enduring religious centers, and left linguistic traces still visible in the names of mountains, rivers, and cities. Whether every one of these communities should be called Pelasgian remains a matter of scholarly debate. Ancient writers themselves did not always agree. Modern historians therefore proceed carefully, distinguishing between evidence that is well established and traditions that remain uncertain. Even with that caution, one conclusion grows increasingly difficult to dismiss. The civilization that later became ancient Greece did not emerge upon an empty stage. It inherited landscapes already shaped by generations of skilled builders, experienced farmers, accomplished craftsmen, and deeply rooted religious traditions. The people remembered as the Pelasgians, whether a single people or several closely related pre-Greek communities, formed an important part of that older world. The next stage of their story explores one of history's most intriguing questions: how these long-established populations encountered the arriving Greek-speaking peoples, and how centuries of contact transformed both cultures in ways that would shape the future of the Mediterranean. By the beginning of the second millennium before Christ, the Aegean was already a landscape filled with established communities. Farmers cultivated fertile plains. Craftsmen produced bronze tools and finely decorated pottery. Merchants carried goods between islands and coastal settlements. Sacred places had already attracted generations of worshippers. The people later remembered as the Pelasgians were not newcomers searching for empty land. They belonged to societies that had developed over many centuries. It was into this world that Greek-speaking populations gradually arrived. Exactly how this movement unfolded remains one of the most carefully studied questions in European prehistory. Unlike the dramatic invasions described in later legends, archaeology presents a slower and far more complex picture. There is little evidence for a single overwhelming conquest that swept across the entire Greek mainland. Instead, different regions experience change at different times. Some communities appear to have absorbed newcomers gradually. Others show evidence of disruption. Still others continued with remarkable continuity while slowly adopting new cultural influences. The story was not the same everywhere. That diversity is one of the strongest lessons archaeology has revealed. The earliest signs of change appear in the archaeological record during the transition into what scholars call the Middle Helladic period. Certain pottery styles begin to change. New architectural forms appear alongside older traditions. Burial customs evolve. Settlement patterns shift in some regions while remaining relatively stable in others. None of these developments alone proves the arrival of new populations. Material culture can change through trade, imitation, or cultural exchange, as well as migration. Yet when several forms of evidence are considered together, many historians conclude that Greek-speaking groups were becoming increasingly established across mainland Greece during this period. Language itself leaves surprisingly subtle traces in archaeology. Unlike pottery or architecture, spoken words rarely survive. Instead, linguists reconstruct ancient movements through place names, later written records, and the relationships between languages themselves. Greek belongs to the Indo-European language family. Its closest relatives developed across wide areas of Europe and Western Asia. At some point, speakers of early Greek entered the southern Balkans and eventually spread into the regions that would later become the Greek world. The precise routes remain debated. The timing continues to be refined as new discoveries emerge. What remains widely accepted is that this process unfolded over generations rather than within a single lifetime. Communities met one another. They traded. They competed. They sometimes fought. They also learned from each other. The archaeological record repeatedly suggests interaction rather than complete replacement. At settlements throughout mainland Greece, older traditions often continued after the appearance of newer ones. Pottery styles blended. Construction techniques combined different influences. Domestic life retained familiar routines even as broader political and linguistic changes unfolded. This gradual blending appears especially clearly in Attica. The region surrounding the future city of Athens possesses an archaeological record stretching back thousands of years before the Classical Age. Excavations beneath the modern city have uncovered evidence of continuous occupation extending deep into prehistory. Different cultural layers overlap one another. Each generation inherited the landscape left by those before it. Ancient writers remembered Pelasgian communities living in this region before Athens became the dominant political power of later centuries. Modern archaeology cannot identify the ethnicity of every excavated household. Yet it confirms that substantial populations occupied Attica long before the rise of the classical polis. Settlement patterns evolved gradually rather than appearing suddenly. This continuity supports the broader picture suggested by both archaeology and ancient literary tradition. One particularly important feature of this transitional period is the persistence of older building techniques. Stone walls continued to be repaired using familiar methods. Homes expanded around earlier foundations. Agricultural terraces remained in use. The arrival of new populations did not erase centuries of accumulated practical knowledge. Instead, successful techniques were adopted regardless of their cultural origin. Experience often mattered more than identity. This practical exchange likely extended into agriculture itself. Communities already familiar with local soils, seasonal rainfall, and regional climate possessed valuable knowledge. New arrivals entering unfamiliar landscapes would have benefited enormously from understanding which crops thrived in particular valleys, when planting should begin, and how water resources could best be managed. Archaeological evidence suggests continuity in many agricultural systems across the transition from pre-Greek to Greek-speaking societies. Terraced hillsides remained productive. Storage methods continued to evolve rather than disappearing. Livestock management followed patterns adapted to local environments over many generations. Technology also spread through contact. Bronze working had already reached a high level before the emergence of Mycenaean civilization. Experienced métalworkers understood à loi composition. They knew how different mixtures affected strength and durability. Casting methods had become increasingly sophisticated. New communities entering these established networks gained access not only to finished tools, but also to generations of accumulated technical knowledge. The same pattern appears in pottery production. Incoming cultural influences introduced new vessel forms and decorative preferences. Yet many manufacturing techniques remained rooted in older traditions. potters continued selecting suitable clay sources. Quince tan familiar construcción príncipes. Firing methods reflected experience developed over centuries. Innovation built upon existing foundations rather than replacing them completely. Trade encouraged even greater interaction. As Greek-speaking communities expanded, they became participants in commercial systems that already linked the Aegean with Anatolia, the Balkans, Cyprus, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Merchants exchanged metals, pottery, textiles, oils, timber, and luxury goods. Harbors grew busier. Sea routes became increasingly important. Every commercial voyage carried more than cargo. Languages met aboard ships. Ideas crossed the sea. Religious symbols spread alongside valuable commodities. Artistic styles traveled from workshop to workshop. The Mediterranean became a network of connected societies rather than isolated civilizations. Religion proved especially capable of preserving continuity across cultural change. When new populations encountered ancient sacred places, they often adopted them instead of abandoning them. The landscape itself encouraged this continuity. A spring believed to possess healing power remained attractive regardless of language. A mountain associated with divine presence retained its spiritual importance. An ancient grove inspired reverence generation after generation. Rather than destroying every earlier sanctuary, many communities reinterpreted them. Older sacred traditions became incorporated into newer religious systems. This process can be observed at several of Greece's most important sanctuaries. At Dodona, worship continued for centuries despite profound cultural changes in the surrounding region. At Eleusis, archaeological evidence indicates religious activity long before the famous mystery cults of historical Greece. The sacred character of the location survived even as rituals evolved. Such continuity reminds historians that religious landscapes often preserve deeper historical memories than political institutions. Marriage likely formed another bridge between communities. Ancient mythology frequently describes unions between Greek heroes and women associated with earlier populations. These stories cannot be treated as literal historical records. They were composed centuries after the events they describe. Yet myths often preserve symbolic reflections of real social processes. Marriage between neighboring communities has been one of the most effective mechanisms of cultural integration throughout human history. Children raised within mixed families naturally learn more than one tradition. Languages influence one another. Customs blend. Old boundaries gradually lose their sharpness. Archaeology cannot identify every marriage that occurred 4,000 years ago. It can, however, reveal communities where cultural traditions became increasingly blended over time. Some cemeteries contain combinations of burial customs previously associated with different groups. Certain settlements display architectural features reflecting multiple traditions. Material culture often tells a story of gradual adaptation rather than sudden transformation. Language changed more slowly. When one language eventually replaces another, traces of the older language frequently survive. Modern linguists call these survivals substrate influences. Words for rivers, mountains, plants, animals, and local customs often outlive the language that first created them. Across Greece, Numerous place names appear to preserve exactly this type of linguistic inheritance. Even where Greek became dominant, earlier names remained attached to the landscape. Their original meanings faded. Their sounds endured. The people speaking Greek gradually accepted them as ordinary parts of everyday geography. Military organization also evolved during this period. As populations increased and settlements expanded, defending valuable territory became increasingly important. Fortified sites occupied strategic hills overlooking fertile valleys and communication routes. Control of such locations offered both security and political influence. Archaeological evidence demonstrates continued investment in defensive architecture throughout the Bronze Age. Walls were strengthened, gateways improved, natural terrain became integrated into broader defensive planning. These developments required organized leadership capable of directing large construction projects. Whether that leadership belonged to communities remembered later as Pelasgian, early Greek, or culturally mixed societies varied from region to region. What remains clear is that political complexity continued increasing across the mainland. By the later Bronze Age, the Mycenaean civilization emerged as the dominant political force across much of southern Greece. Magnificent palaces appeared at Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and elsewhere. Administrators recorded economic information using the Linear B script, the earliest known written form of Greek. These records transformed our understanding of early Greek history. Unlike the undeciphered Linear, a script of Minoan Crete, Linear B can be read. Its clay tablets reveal inventories, religious offerings, agricultural production, and administrative organization. Interestingly, they say almost nothing directly about the Pelasgians. This silence is itself significant. By the time the Mycenaean palace system reached its height, many earlier populations had likely already been absorbed into the expanding Greek-speaking world. Political identities change more rapidly than landscapes. Languages spread. Administrative systems standardize communication. Older identities gradually become less visible in official records, even while surviving within local traditions and everyday life. Centuries later, when Greek historians attempted to explain the origins of their civilization, they looked back beyond the Mycenaean age toward an even deeper past. They found memories of ancient peoples who had lived before them. Those memories were imperfect. They blended history with legend. Yet they consistently pointed toward one conclusion. Before the rise of the Greek city-states, the Aegean had already been home to flourishing societies whose achievements formed part of the foundation upon which later Greek civilization was built. The people remembered as the Pelasgians stand at the center of that memory. The next stage of their story follows one of the most fascinating pieces of evidence ever discovered: the mysterious connections between the language of Lemnos and the civilization of the Etruscans in ancient Italy, a puzzle that continues to challenge historians and linguists today. Few discoveries in Mediterranean archaeology have generated as much discussion as the weathered stone uncovered on the island of Lemnos during the 19th century. Unlike magnificent temples or royal palaces, it was not its appearance that transformed historical research. Its importance lay in the words carved across its surface. Those words belonged to a language that was clearly not Greek. At first glance, the inscription seemed almost familiar. Its alphabet shared characteristics with other writing systems used around the Mediterranean during the early first millennium before Christ. Yet when scholars attempted to read the language itself, they quickly realized they were facing something entirely different. The grammar did not resemble Greek. Its vocabulary resisted explanation through known Indo-European languages. The more researchers examined the text, the more intriguing it became. Then another observation changed the entire conversation. Several linguistic features appeared remarkably similar to the language once spoken by the Etruscans in central Italy. For generations, the Etruscans had already occupied a unique place in ancient history. Long before Rome became the dominant power of Italy, Etruscan cities flourished across what is now Tuscany and neighboring regions. Their engineers drained marshes. Their craftsmen produced remarkable bronze work. Their merchants traded across the Mediterranean. Their priests developed complex religious traditions that even the Romans later respected. Yet despite their importance, one mystery surrounded them from the beginning. Where had they come from? Ancient authors themselves could not agree. Herodotus famously recorded a tradition claiming that the ancestors of the Etruscans had migrated from Lydia in western Anatolia during a time of famine. According to his account, part of the population remained behind while another group sailed west under the leadership of Tyrrhenus. Eventually, they settled in Italy and became known to history as the Tyrrhenians, a name closely associated with the Etruscans. Not every ancient writer accepted this story. Dionysius of Halicarnassus rejected it centuries later. He argued that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy rather than immigrants from the eastern Mediterranean. His reasoning rested largely upon differences in language and custom compared with the peoples of Anatolia known during his own lifetime. The disagreement between these two respected historians has continued to influence scholarship ever since. Modern archaeology approaches the question differently. Instead of relying solely upon literary tradition, researchers compare settlements, artifacts, inscriptions, environmental evidence, and increasingly, scientific methods such as genetic analysis. The result has been a far more nuanced picture than either ancient author could have imagined. The Lemnian inscription became central to that discussion because it suggested that languages related to Etruscan may once have existed much farther east than Italy. Linguists noticed similarities in grammatical endings. Certain personal names followed comparable patterns. Several words appeared to share common roots. No single similarity would have been convincing by itself. Languages can borrow isolated words from neighbors. Trade encourages vocabulary exchange. Religious terminology often spreads across cultural boundaries. Yet the deeper grammatical structure attracted particular attention. Grammar is usually far more resistant to borrowing than individual words. When two languages share distinctive grammatical features, the possibility of a historical relationship becomes much stronger. Over time, many specialists came to classify Lemnian and Etruscan within what is now often called the Tercinian language family. This proposed family generally includes three known ancient languages: Etruscan from central Italy, Lemnian from the northern Aegean, and Raetic, spoken in parts of the Alps during antiquity. Each survives only in fragmentary inscriptions. None possesses extensive surviving literature. Even so, Together, they preserve evidence for a linguistic tradition distinct from the Indo-European languages that eventually came to dominate much of Europe. Exactly how these languages became separated across such a wide geographical area remains uncertain. Several possibilities continue to be debated. One proposal suggests ancient population movements from the eastern Mediterranean toward Italy. Another argues that related communities once occupied a much broader region before later migrations gradually divided them. A third possibility envisions long periods of maritime contact during which closely connected coastal populations maintained linguistic relationships across considerable distances. None of these explanations has gained universal acceptance. Each possesses strengths. Each also faces important challenges. Archaeology contributes valuable evidence to the discussion. Across parts of Italy, researchers have identified material culture showing broad connections with the Eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. Imported pottery appears in Etruscan settlements. Luxury goods travel between regions. Metalworking techniques spread across the sea. These discoveries confirm sustained contact between Italy and the Aegean. They do not necessarily prove large-scale migration. Trade alone can produce extensive cultural exchange. Nevertheless, they demonstrate that neither region existed in isolation. Maritime connections linked them long before classical history began. The Etruscans themselves became famous for their extraordinary skill in bronze working. Weapons, mirrors, ritual vessels, armor, statues. Their workshops produced objects admired throughout the Mediterranean. Interestingly, advanced bronze industries had also flourished for centuries within parts of the Aegean traditionally associated with pre-Greek populations. This does not mean one culture simply copied the other. Bronze metallurgy developed in many places. Yet the movement of skilled craftsmen, techniques, and ideas across commercial networks remains entirely plausible. Architecture provides another area for careful comparison. Early Etruscan settlements frequently occupied naturally defensible hills. Their communities displayed organized planning. Fortification walls protected important centers. Across the Aegean, similar strategic principles guided settlement placement long before classical Greece. Again, similarity does not necessarily indicate common ancestry. Mountain landscapes often encourage comparable solutions to similar problems. Historians therefore distinguish carefully between parallel development and evidence for direct cultural connection. Religious traditions add another intriguing dimension. Etruscan religion emphasized ritual precision. Priests interpreted signs from the natural world. The flight of birds, lightning, sacred boundaries, ceremonial observations formed essential parts of public life. Some scholars have noted broad similarities with older forms of religious practice found elsewhere in the Mediterranean, particularly traditions emphasizing communication through natural phenomena rather than monumental temples alone. Such comparisons must be approached cautiously. Many ancient cultures practiced forms of divination. Nevertheless, they remind us that religious ideas traveled widely alongside merchants and migrants. The sea connected cultures as much as it separated them. Trade routes crossing the Mediterranean became channels for constant interaction. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin arrived from distant regions. Amber traveled south from northern Europe. Ivory reached Aegean ports from Africa and the Near East. Luxury ceramics changed hands repeatedly before reaching their final destinations. Every harbor became a meeting place of languages and traditions. Sailors exchanged stories. Craftsmen shared techniques. Religious symbols appeared far from their original homes. The Bronze Age Mediterranean functioned less as a collection of isolated civilizations than as an interconnected world linked by the sea. Lemnos occupied an ideal position within these maritime networks. Any vessel sailing between the Black Sea, Anatolia, mainland Greece, and the central Mediterranean could potentially pass near the island. Its harbors offered shelter. Its agricultural resources supplied provisions. Its location encouraged constant contact with travelers from many different regions. Such circumstances naturally fostered cultural exchange. The question remains whether exchange alone explains the linguistic relationship suggested by the Lemnian inscription. Most specialists believe the similarities extend beyond what ordinary trade would be expected to produce. Shared grammatical structures usually point toward deeper historical relationships. Even so, determining exactly when those relationships developed remains extremely difficult. The surviving evidence is simply too limited to reconstruct every stage with confidence. Recent scientific advances have added new perspectives while also illustrating the complexity of ancient population history. Ancient DNA studies reveal that prehistoric Mediterranean populations experienced repeated episodes of movement, interaction, and mixture over thousands of years. No ancient civilization emerged in complete isolation. Communities continually exchange people as well as ideas. These findings support the broader archaeological picture of an interconnected Bronze Age world. At the same time, genetic evidence cannot identify cultural labels such as Pelasgian or Etruscan with complete precision. Genes, languages, and identities do not always move together. A population may adopt a new language without major genetic change. Conversely, migration may occur without replacing existing cultural traditions. For this reason, historians combine genetic evidence with archaeology, linguistics, and written sources rather than relying upon any single line of evidence alone. The debate surrounding the Lemnian inscription therefore remains open. Its importance lies not in providing every answer, but in demonstrating that the ancient Mediterranean was more diverse than earlier generations once imagined. Long before the rise of classical Greece and Republican Rome, multiple languages coexisted across the region. Some flourished for centuries before gradually disappearing. Others survived only in scattered inscriptions left behind by communities whose names are now barely remembered. The Pelasgians occupy a unique position within this larger story. Ancient Greek writers repeatedly associated them with the oldest layers of Aegean history. The archaeological record confirms the existence of sophisticated pre-Greek societies. The Lemnian inscription preserves evidence for a non-Greek language surviving into historical times. The possible relationship with Etruscan expands the discussion far beyond Greece itself, connecting the northern Aegean with one of Italy's greatest ancient civilizations. Whether these connections resulted from shared ancestry, prolonged interaction, or a combination of both remains one of the most fascinating questions in Mediterranean archaeology. What is increasingly clear, however, is that the world before classical Greece was far richer, more connected, and more culturally diverse than earlier historians once believed. As researchers continued excavating ancient sanctuaries, another aspect of Pelasgian civilization began to emerge with increasing clarity. Their religious traditions, sacred landscapes, and spiritual practices, many of which appear to have influenced some of the most important centers of worship in the ancient Greek world. Religion has always preserved memories that politics often forgets. Empires rise and disappear. Cities are destroyed and rebuilt. Languages evolve. Dynasties vanish. Yet sacred places frequently endure through every transformation. For this reason, some of the strongest evidence for the deep antiquity of the Pelasgian world survives not in royal palaces or military fortifications, but in the landscapes where generations gathered to worship. Across Greece, archaeologists have repeatedly uncovered Bronze Age layers beneath sanctuaries that later became famous during the classical period. At Dodona, at Eleusis, on Samothrace, and at many smaller regional shrines. The names of the gods eventually changed. The rituals evolved. New myths were attached to ancient places. Yet the sacred character of those locations remained remarkably consistent. This continuity is one of the most striking patterns visible in the archaeological record. Ancient Greek authors themselves recognized it. They frequently described certain sanctuaries as older than the Greek peoples who later worshipped there. Although they interpreted these traditions through mythology, modern archaeology has confirmed that many of these sacred sites were indeed active centuries before the rise of the classical city-states. The oracle at Dodona offers perhaps the clearest example. Long before marble temples appeared, worship centered upon a sacred grove of oak trees. Natural sounds formed part of religious practice. The movement of leaves, the calls of birds, the ringing of suspended bronze objects stirred by the wind. These traditions differed from a monumental temple worship that later characterized much of Greek religion. Instead, they reflected a worldview in which the natural environment itself served as the medium between humanity and the divine. Whether those early worshippers identified themselves as Pelasgians cannot be demonstrated directly. No inscription says so. Yet both ancient literary traditions and archaeological evidence point toward religious practices rooted deeply in the pre-Greek past. The same pattern appears elsewhere. At Eleusis, one of the most important religious centers of classical Greece, excavations have revealed activity stretching back into the Bronze Age. Long before the famous Eleusinian mysteries attracted initiates from across the Mediterranean, the site already possessed religious significance. Agriculture, fertility, seasonal renewal, and the cycle of life and death formed the heart of its traditions. Those themes were fundamental to farming societies everywhere. They almost certainly long predated the myths later associated with Demeter and Persephone. Samothrace tells a similar story. Its sanctuary of the great gods became one of antiquity's most respected centers of initiation. Kings, generals, philosophers, and ordinary travelers crossed the sea to participate in ceremonies whose deepest rituals remained secret. Ancient authors believe the sanctuary possessed pre-Greek origins. Modern archaeology confirms that religious activity there reaches back well before the classical period. Exactly what those earliest ceremonies involved remains unknown. The mystery itself became part of the site's enduring identity. Religion was only one inheritance. Architecture also preserved remarkable continuity. The great stone fortifications that impressed Greek travelers continued to dominate landscapes long after their builders had disappeared from history. Even when later communities forgot who had constructed them, the walls themselves remained. Ancient authors sometimes attributed these enormous structures to the Cyclopes. Others connected them with the Pelasgians. Modern archaeology has shown that such monuments belong to different periods and different societies across the Bronze Age. Yet the essential observation made by the ancients was correct. These walls were already ancient by the time classical Greece emerged. The engineering knowledge required to construct them formed part of a much older Mediterranean tradition. Language preserved another layer of memory. Throughout Greece, countless place names survived political change. Rivers continued flowing beneath names whose meanings had long been forgotten. Mountains retained ancient identities. Cities inherited names older than the languages spoken by many of their inhabitants. Modern linguistics cannot identify every pre-Greek language represented by these names. The evidence is simply too fragmentary. Nevertheless, it clearly demonstrates that Greek speakers inherited a landscape already named by earlier populations. Those ancient voices still echo quietly across modern maps. Archaeology has also transformed our understanding of daily life in the pre-Greek Aegean. For many years, early scholarship tended to portray prehistoric communities as simple villages waiting for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. Excavation after excavation has overturned that assumption. The settlements associated with the pre-Greek world reveal organized urban planning, specialized craft production, long-distance trade, advanced metallurgy, agricultural innovation, sophisticated religious practices, and complex social organization. These achievements developed gradually over thousands of years. They were not the products of isolated genius. They represented the accumulated experience of countless generations. The Pelasgians therefore occupy an important place, not because every archaeological discovery can be assigned to them with certainty. It cannot. The ancient term itself may have referred to multiple communities rather than one unified nation. Different Greek authors used it in different ways. Sometimes it described specific populations. Sometimes it served as a broader label for ancient inhabitants remembered before the spread of Greek-speaking peoples. Recognizing that uncertainty is essential for understanding the evidence honestly. History rarely provides simple answers to questions reaching back 5,000 years. The available evidence does not support the image of a single Pelasgian empire stretching across the entire Mediterranean. Nor does it support the idea that every pre-Greek monument belonged to one people speaking one language. Instead, archaeology reveals a mosaic of interconnected societies. Some probably shared languages. Others shared technologies. Many participated in the same maritime trade networks while maintaining distinct local identities. The Pelasgian traditions preserved by Greek authors may well reflect memories of several closely related pre-Greek populations whose identities gradually blended together in later historical memory. That conclusion is not a weakness. It reflects the complexity of the ancient world itself. Cultures were rarely isolated. Communities interacted continuously. Ideas crossed seas more easily than political boundaries. Trade encouraged cooperation. Competition encouraged innovation. Migration introduced new influences while older traditions persisted beneath changing political structures. The emergence of Greek civilization did not erase everything that came before it. Instead, it absorbed many earlier traditions while reshaping them into something new. This process can be seen throughout history. Roman civilization inherited from the Etruscans and the Greeks. The Byzantine world inherited from Rome. Every civilization stands upon foundations laid by earlier generations. The same was true for ancient Greece. Its remarkable achievements in philosophy, architecture, literature, science, and politics emerged within landscapes already shaped by thousands of years of human experience. Farmers had already transformed the land. Builders had already mastered stone construction. Metal workers had already refined bronze technology. Sailors had already mapped sea routes linking distant shores. Religious traditions had already established sacred places that continued attracting worshippers for centuries. The Pelasgians, however they're defined, belong to that deeper history. Modern research continues to reshape our understanding of them. New excavations uncover previously unknown settlements. Improved dating techniques refine archaeological chronologies. Scientific analysis reveals ancient diets, trade patterns, environmental change, and technological development with increasing precision. Ancient DNA studies provide entirely new perspectives on prehistoric population movements, while also reminding us that biological ancestry, language, and cultural identity do not always follow the same paths. Linguists continue studying the Lemnian inscription and the relationship between the Tersinian languages. Every new discovery contributes another small piece to the puzzle. Many questions remain unanswered. What language did the earliest inhabitants of mainland Greece actually speak? How many different pre-Greek languages existed across the Aegean? To what extent did those communities identify themselves as distinct peoples? How closely were they connected to Anatolia, the Balkans, Crete, or Italy? Did the word Pelasgian describe one culture remembered imperfectly, or many cultures later gathered beneath a single traditional name? These questions remain active areas of scholarly research. The absence of complete certainty does not diminish the importance of the evidence. Instead, it reminds us that history is an ongoing investigation rather than a finished story. Each generation returns to the past with better methods, new discoveries, and fresh questions. Sometimes long-held ideas are confirmed. Sometimes they are revised. Occasionally, they are abandoned altogether. The story of the Pelasgians demonstrates exactly how historical knowledge evolves. Ancient literary traditions first preserved memories of an older world. Archaeology then uncovered settlements, proving that sophisticated societies flourished across the Aegean long before classical Greece. Linguistics revealed traces of forgotten languages preserved in inscriptions and place names. Scientific research added new layers of evidence impossible to imagine even a century ago. Together, these disciplines do not solve every mystery. They do something equally valuable. They reveal that the ancient Mediterranean was a place of extraordinary diversity, continuous interaction, and remarkable human achievement long before the civilizations most familiar to us entered recorded history. The Pelasgians emerge from that distant world not as shadowy legends, but as part of a much broader human story. A story of communities adapting to changing environments, of farmers transforming landscapes, of sailors connecting distant shores, of craftsmen refining technologies through generations of experience, of sacred places preserving memory across thousands of years, of languages appearing, evolving, and eventually fading into silence while leaving traces that survive to the present day. Perhaps that is their greatest legacy. Not a lost empire, not a forgotten dynasty, but a reminder that history extends far beyond the boundaries of written records. Long before famous kings, philosophers, and conquerors shaped the course of Mediterranean history, countless generations had already built the foundations upon which later civilizations would stand. Their names were often forgotten. Their languages disappeared. Their political identities dissolved into the societies that followed. Yet their influence endured. Every ancient road built upon older paths. Every sanctuary inherited older traditions. Every city rose upon landscapes already rich with memory. The Pelasgians remain one of history's greatest mysteries precisely because they stand at the meeting point between archaeology, language, legend, and memory. Their story reminds us that the ancient world was never as simple as later generations imagined. It was connected. It was dynamic. It was shaped by countless peoples whose contributions cannot always be separated neatly into modern categories. And although the name Pelasgian eventually disappeared from history as a living identity, the civilization remembered by that name never truly vanished. Its knowledge, its traditions, and its influence continued within the cultures that followed, becoming part of the enduring foundation of the ancient Mediterranean itself. And that is where the story of the Pelasgians comes to its close.